I saw them all sitting around that table in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. I'm sure they did a lot of interesting things in 4 hours. But fundamentally, if you want to get a peace deal in Ukraine, you're going to need the people who are going to have to put skin in the game to make it happen. You know, Donald Trump, if you remember, took all his contributions off the table. Wasn't going to give security guarantees, wasn't going to have troops on the ground, wasn't going to continue any aid, and was going to give Putin all the things he's asking for. And the reality is, leadership is generosity. Leadership is about being slightly generous, but it's also about leading people and contributing yourselves. And I think what he's seeing is that unless the United States is prepared to give a security backstop or continue to support, what's Zelenskyy got to lose by saying, actually, my partners in this is Europe, the United Kingdom and other countries. And, at the moment, Russia isn't moving.
But noting what you say, surely, Sir Ben, the fact that the two main protagonists are actually speaking has to be seen as some move forward.
Well, I only see Russia speaking to America. I don't see Russia speaking to Ukraine, and I don't see Ukraine speaking to Russia.
All negative. Yes, I'm so sorry. The last 2 days.
I don't think. I mean, I heard him saying I could have done a deal. I mean, if President Trump's facts are based on untruths or fake news, as he would call it, the Ukraine started the war. I mean, let's examine that fact. Well, no, Russia invaded in 2014, having given its word at the Budapest Memorandum that it would respect Ukraine. And Russia then invaded again in 2022. Let's look at the other fact. You often hear America, and I heard him in the Oval Office last week say, we've given double what Europe's given. No, actually, Europe's given more collectively to Ukraine than the United States. And now you hear this one about, he hasn't had an election, right? That's the latest.
Yes.
Well, Winston Churchill didn't have an election for 6 years because we were fighting the Second World War. It didn't make us undemocratic. It's because, funnily enough, we were fighting for our survival as Ukraine is. And no doubt the constitution of Ukraine will be upheld and there'll be an election whenever that is possible. But you see these lines that are very similar to the Russians' line.
Well, I was going to ask you, no one will know the answer to this question, but you've probably got closer feelers than most. How will those pictures, how will this news go down within the Kremlin?
Oh, I think the Kremlin have been pretty happy
I would have thought,
since day one. I mean, if the White House is repeating those sort of propaganda lines that, Ukraine started the war, etc., then of course they'll be really happy that people are rewriting history. I saw another comment the president made, I think, yesterday that, Russia's only done 20%. It could have done 100%. It could be there. It could really try. Well, it did try. It put 165,000 troops into the invasion of Ukraine and lost them all. So it actually lost its main modern land army. It's having to regenerate that. And I think this is where the penny hasn't quite dropped. The Ukrainians, who were a tiny force, badly equipped, have held off and defeated to some extent, certainly decimated, 700,000 Russians in 3 years.
So am I to take from you, Sir Ben, that in this instance you find yourself perhaps supporting Sir Keir Starmer more than you might have first thought, in that he says Ukraine has to be part of a Ukrainian peace?
Yes. I mean, look, defence and our security should always be non-partisan.
Yeah, okay.
I believe. It's not about who did what when. Fundamentally, Sir Keir is doing the right thing. He is trying to lead a group of Europeans, and the Europeans do want leadership on this. You've got German elections, so you can't have a German leader at the moment. You've got Macron, who is saying the right things, but he's got a weak political base. He is trying to do the right thing. He's going to try, obviously, and speak to Donald Trump and persuade him that the best alternative is some contribution by the United States. He's talked about a security backstop.
Yeah.
But also,
you hold with that idea of a backstop, Sir Ben?
I absolutely, well, if it's possible, but also in defence of Donald Trump, the other part of the message from last week in Munich was absolutely the same message that many of us have been saying for a long time, which is we have to stand up and contribute to our own security and not take American support for granted. And for over a decade, ever since Obama came in the Cardiff NATO conference, the Americans have been asking us nicely, please contribute more, please make defence more of a priority, and we have ignored it and indulged ourselves on other public sector spending. And Rachel Reeves had her budget. She took billions of pounds out of our tax, gave £22 billion to the NHS, and gave billions to the environmental net zero thing, and non-productive pay rises, etc. That's her choice, right? The leaders to choose. They've made their choice for now. But what America is saying, I'm sorry, guys, the world is more dangerous. Reprioritise, and in that prioritisation, push defence up the agenda.
How disappointed are you that we still hear from the Prime Minister only speak of a roadmap to get to 2.5% of GDP spending on defence?
Well, if after the Vice President's speech and the US Defence Secretary's speeches last week, if the penny hasn't dropped, then I fear, I actually fear for the integrity of NATO.
Do you think J.D. Vance was on the money, as it were?
Some of his speech was on the money.
What parts do you support? That we're in a crisis of confidence? That we're almost taking US for suckers, that sort of line?
The bit about we have taken for granted US support for security of Europe. You know, the American generals were on the hook for 340,000 US servicemen and women to come to our aid, right? 340,000. If I had that liability as a defence secretary, I'd be wanting to make sure that the allies that help that happen and support are properly equipped and properly armed, properly ammoed up, and we're just not. So, you know, if we value NATO, and I do, it's one of the most successful military alliances in our history, 75 years on, we have to play our part. That's the bit I totally agree with the United States on, and we can't fuss around and faff around about 0.1% of GDP, 0.2%. You know, we have to actually go back to the levels we spent in our Cold War era of about 3%, start investing. Poland's done it. Many of those other smaller countries have started to do it. Denmark cancelled a public holiday to do it and to increase their revenues. And they had political courage to their population to say, we have to change things.
When Sir Keir talks of putting British troops as part of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, Sir Ben, you'll know better again than most, have we got enough blokes and women and kit to do it?
We haven't got a good enough enabled armed forces at the moment to be in more than one place.
So we'd have to take them someplace else.
We'd have to, first of all, invest. We could in the short term. So financial pressures on defence come in two forms. One is sustainability. How long can you actually deploy your troops? How long can they be there? And every time, you know, the longer you're there, you have to either rotate or replenish, and that costs money. And the other one is how many have you got to do it in the first place? So they sort of overlap. So, of course, you could put some troops in early on, quite quickly, and actually to change the calculation that Russia would have to make to continue attacks is all about how many people in uniform are there. So if there's, you know, there's a saying, how many Americans on duty does it take to deter Russia? One, right? One. Because Russia has to decide whether it wants to kill Americans or not. So fundamentally, you know, by being there, you start to make a presence. You would then have time, because the Russian army is so decimated, it'll take the Russians about 2 to 3 years to re-equip, rearm, and modernise their armed forces, maybe even longer. You know, you can't lose 700,000 dead, injured or deserted personnel, thousands of tanks, and just mend that. So you have time for us to spend an increased defence budget to start getting up into the right places.